I'm going to show you how to knit Continental style, the knit stitch and the purl. It's much easier, it's much quicker, and I think that you'll like it a lot better than the regular stitch. So the difference between the English version or whatever and the Continental style is that you're holding your yarn in the opposite hand. So instead of having to wrap it every time you want to make another stitch, it flows a lot better because you're just hooking the yarn around the needle. So you take your working yarn, which is the yarn attached to your skein or ball of yarn, and you place it over your pinky, underneath the rest of your fingers, and around your index finger as many times as you need. It's really key that you keep your stitches loose when knitting Continental, otherwise you won't be able to wrap the yarn around your needle and get it through the stitch you're working on. So it's best to try and keep your finger and needle as close together as possible so that you really only need like an inch showing here. So to make the knit stitch, you place your needle underneath the stitch from behind, see? And then if it's a little bit tight, especially in the beginning, you can use your other fingers to help. But basically, what you do is you wrap the yarn around your needle and pull it through. It's super simple, and you can make the stitches as loose or tight as you want, but it's really best if you make them at least a little bit looser than you normally would, because it makes it so much easier and quicker to be able to get that stitch through the loop that you're working on. So this is the knit stitch, and as you can see, if you make your stitches too tight, it can be a real pain to try and get it back through. So some people, if they're super skilled, like Juniper, who's from Germany, she doesn't need to use this extra finger, to help wrap the yarn over. And if you need to re-wrap the yarn on your hand, that's fine too, especially in the beginning, because you really want to keep it as close as possible. And especially when you're first starting out, you'll find yourself kind of pulling it taut. That's bad. If you see yourself doing that and you have like a mile of yarn in between your needle and your finger, stop and rewind it. So another way you can do this is literally, instead of using the fingers on your right hand to help pull it out, you can just, I don't know how you would call this, like, kind of making you move your needles more so that it's easier to pull this yarn through without having to use this finger to help it. See, and if you pull it back kind of and twist it, then it helps. But that's really not necessary, especially if you're first learning. So if I were you, Kiri, I would just use this finger to help pull that yarn off onto your other needle. And then purling is essentially this same stitch backwards. And when you combine knitting and purling, you get what's called a stockinet stitch. And that means that it's flat on one side, that's your knit stitch, and bumpy on the other. See, this is the purl stitch that I'm going to show you in just a second. Purls are round, so it makes more sense that their stitch has more of a round shape to it. And then knitting is more flat. So to purl, especially if, I don't know, you want it to be easier, you want to bring this yarn, instead of having it behind the needle, bring it forward. And if you're switching back and forth, then you might want to rewrap the yarn on your fingers just to make sure that it's loose enough. So bring your stitches forward a little, and keep it in front, and instead of going behind like we did for the knit stitch, we're going to go from in front. And you're going to just wrap it around and pull it off, and see it forms that little bump. That means that you've purled. So keep your yarn in front insert the needle from behind, wrap the yarn around, and pull it through. And if you do anything in stockinette stitch, you want to cast on, and then your first row you're going to purl. That way you don't have like a weird extra row of bumps when you're looking at your knitted side, because purls are the back of a knit stitch and knits are the back of a purl stitch. So after you purl your first row, the essential rule of knitting is to knit the knits and purl the purls. So for this row, I need to knit, because the knitted stitch looks basically like a little flat braid, and the purl stitch is that round one that I showed you earlier. So what I mean by knit the knits and purl the purls is, if you see a stitch in your work and you're following a pattern and it says to just knit, and you don't know if you need to knit the whole thing or purl it or whatever, look at the stitch that you're about to use. If it's flat like this and it's got a little V shape, you knit it and you keep the yarn in back. But if it's got a little bump under your stitch, then you would purl it and put the yarn in front. Sorry, I have it too tight. And go from the back and pull it through. So for each row you would just purl and then knit, and then purl and then knit, and it forms this really nice fabric that's flat on the one side where you have all your knit stitches and real bumpy on the other. Usually, like if you're making a rabbit, you would have the knit side facing, because it just looks really pretty, and that's kind of the whole point of doing the stockinette stitch, is having this nice flat pattern. And that's how you knit Continental style. Hope you liked it.